Thank you. So I already prefaced this before with my question. I'm a neuropsychologist, so I'm a little bit different than a lot of people in the audience. I specialize in understanding aging and the intersection between brain and behavior relationships as we get older, and how that may affect our financial and health decision making as well as other abilities. And this presentation is going to be done in conjunction with Gary Matola from the FINRA Foundation. So I'll get us started, and then Gary's going to tell you some more about some specific findings. So as you mentioned, we're going to be focusing on aging. We know that aging presents some unique challenges that can impact financial and health choices. In particular, a lot of older adults experience some changes in cognition, memory, and other thinking abilities. We know that currently about 6 million Americans suffer from dementia, a syndrome of severe cognitive impairment, where individuals are unable to care for themselves, make their own decisions really with good integrity. And yet, this is just the most severe end of the spectrum when we think about aging. Still, another very big swath of individuals experience milder changes in cognitive function and thinking abilities. So there's a syndrome that some of you probably have heard of called mild cognitive impairment, where individuals may have memory or other thinking difficulties, not enough to impair their daily activities of living, so they're able to function in the real world, able to generally take care of themselves, but they're not really functioning at their baseline level. This is thought, and mild cognitive impairment is thought to affect around 10 million older adults. And it's something that often flies under the radar. There are no treatments for this condition currently. And so older adults are dealing with these challenges to their thinking, memory, and other abilities that really there's no cure, no support for. And this, of course, can affect financial and other types of decision making. At the same time, we know that older adults are losing other resources, important resources, social, for example. So their networks are constricting as they're losing loved ones, they're losing their spouse, they're losing friends and people of the same age, they're losing their community. They're also losing functional capabilities in terms of physical function. So they're not as able to get out and about in the world to acquire knowledge, to get information they may need to make important decisions. So there's a whole host of challenges that are really unique to this aspect of the lifespan that come into play when we think about financial and health decision making. And yet at the same time, as you all know, older adults need to make important financial and health decisions, Social Security, retirement decisions, end of life transfers of wealth, and so on. And these things are happening in the context of dealing with those cognitive, social, and functional changes. I started working with Gary and the FINRA Foundation in 2019 to try to study some of these issues. And I'm working on a cohort study of aging. It's going to be different than what you might be used to here. It's not a survey study. I'll tell you a little bit about that in just a minute. But essentially our goal was really to bring to bear sort of a research perspective where we are bringing in the cognitive, neurologic perspective, understanding how changes in cognition and other functional measures may impact decisions and other sorts of behaviors, and also integrate that with policy making and intervention strategies for how can we help older adults do better as they face the challenges that we know are unique to this time of the lifespan. In our conceptual model, we know that decision making is not driven by just one factor alone. So as you all know, cognitive function, your ability to think and reason, is an important factor. And we and others have shown this. Certainly cognitive function is a major driver of decision making. It's not the only thing, though. We know that contextual factors, things like financial literacy, which we've heard a lot about today, as well as economic resources, socioeconomic status, financial fragility, those factors also play into how someone makes choices and what their range of options are, as well as psychological and psychosocial functioning. So things like loneliness, depressive symptoms, mood in general, all of these, optimism, which we talked about earlier, all of these factors come into play, and they interact with each other. So there's a decision making really reflects a dynamic and complex interplay between multiple skills and abilities. And our aim here is to kind of try to tease out what's related to what and identify where we can have inputs that we might be able to intervene to help people make better decisions as they get older. So the data that we're going to show you today, and Gary's going to present some of the findings, come from a study called the Rush Memory and Aging Project. We study about 4,000 older adults from around the Chicago area. It's a cohort study of chronic conditions of aging. So what we do is we take older people when they're in their 60s and 70s. They're cognitively normal at this point, generally in decent health, and we follow them annually. And we document cognitive function, physical function, psychological functioning, and a whole host of other behaviors. They have MRIs very frequently, blood work, and so on. And we follow them over time to see who develops dementia, who doesn't, and we measure a whole range of behaviors so we can understand how people essentially go through the aging process. This study overall started in 1997, but starting in 2010, we added a sub-study focused on financial and health decision making. And in that, we look at a range of real-world and also experimental measures of financial and health decision making, and also other factors like vulnerability to fraud and scams. We know that fraud is particularly problematic among the elderly. Some estimates suggest upwards of $30 billion annually are lost to fraud, depending on who you ask and how they study that. But we know these things are major problems. All of these things are factors we're looking at, and essentially what we're trying to do is understand what are the behaviors underlying change in these things, and how can we ameliorate any problems in these areas. We know that a variety of factors, as I said, are related. Cognitive function is essential for decision making. So we found that not only is your age-related decline in cognition associated with how you do in terms of decision making, but decision making also predicts what's going to happen to you going forward. So we are seeing, and this is something that I imagine a lot of you here are aware of, that early changes in decision making, difficulty making financial choices, difficulty understanding the factors at play, are related to your likely outcome. So financial decision making changes do seem to be an indicator of adverse health outcomes to come. So someone that's having trouble with difficult choices is more likely to develop dementia, for example, or go on to develop more cognitive problems over time. Now, less is known about how cognition interacts with the other factors that we talked about, psychological, psychosocial, and contextual factors, and how they relate to decision making. But as I mentioned, we know that there's a delicate balance there, and Gary is going to tell you a little bit about some of the findings we've had looking at how these things might relate to each other and how they work together to impact financial and health decision making.
Well, good afternoon. I'm going to cover 3 studies in 5 minutes, so buckle in, people. I was keeping track over there. We already had a discussion about this. So let's be quick here. So in terms of psychosocial factors, we looked at loneliness for a number of reasons, but we also want to look at how loneliness interacts with cognition. And this is in terms of financial decision making. And we did find, as expected, that cognition was related to decision making, lower levels of cognition, lower levels of financial and health decision making. But we didn't find an effect for loneliness, which we had expected. based on a number of past studies and some theories. But we did find an interaction. So loneliness mattered, but it only really mattered if you had low cognition. So it's a classic interaction effect. And we believe the reason for that is that, well, we're not quite sure, but it could be that loneliness is often associated with intuitive kind of decision-making, whereas as opposed to rational decision-making. And we think that intuitive decision-making might be more problematic among low cognition panelists than others. So hold on a second. And this graph just shows that. So basically on the horizontal axis, you see loneliness. It was measured with 5 questions, a widely used loneliness scale. And you can see the decision-making on the vertical axis. And you can see that black line on top. That's the average cognition level, the average cognition group, no effect. But you could see among the low cognition group, as the loneliness increased, decision-making ability decreased as well. I did that in about 2 minutes. How's that? Study 2, contextual factors. So we're trying to hit on each of the different areas. For contextual factors, we chose financial and health literacy. And yes, we're interested in financial and health literacy, but we're also interested in the decline of it. So remember, this is a longitudinal study. We could actually, every year, they get a financial and health literacy assessment. So we can actually calculate a slope for everybody, simple regression slope, and we could see how if that slope essentially correlates with decision-making ability. A couple of things we found was that one, as expected at baseline, the first time we assessed their financial literacy and health literacy, low levels of financial and health literacy, as expected, lower levels of decision making. But we also found the rate of decline is important, and the higher the rate of decline, the less the lower levels of decision making, and that's above and beyond the baseline level. So in addition to the baseline level, the rate of decline also impacts decision-making ability. By the way, in this particular study, we looked at some other dependent variables to see how they related to declining financial literacy, and we found scam susceptibility was related to it, and psychological well-being as well. And in an unpublished paper, we have a manuscript right now, actually with Olivia, where we looked at whether men and women decline at the same rate. And they do. they decline at the same rate, and actually the probability or likelihood of decline there's no difference between men and women. And by the way, about 80% of the sample actually declined. 20% either maintained, and a small group actually increased their financial and health literacy over this time period. And then, with like 2 minutes left, we kind of shifted gears, and we used the Memory and Aging Project panelists as essentially subjects in an experiment. And we wanted to assess essentially how they respond to a scam offer. And so why do we want to do an experiment? For those of you who are familiar with studying financial fraud, it's very, very difficult. Usually it's done with surveys, and people don't like to admit that they lost money in a fraud. And also, a lot of people don't know that they lost money in a fraud. So it's usually underreported. So we want to look at actual behavior. So we basically created a fraudulent marketing campaign. Has anybody heard of the U.S. Retirement Protection Task Force? That's what we
have now.
So basically, we created this fictitious agency, and the premise was, hey, somebody hacked into your retirement savings account. And, we didn't say Social Security, but hacked into your retirement account. We just want to confirm if it was you or not and get some information from you. And it was a multi-channel campaign: emails, direct mail, and phone calls. We're focusing on phone calls for the most part because this is an older group, the Memory and Aging Project panelists. So they were answering the phone. They weren't really looking at their emails.
Is this legal in the U.S.? Doing this?
Yes, it was IRB approved.
We're wondering.
So what did we find? Well, we had about 650 subjects. Most didn't engage, 69%, which was good. And then we had a skeptical engagement group. They spoke to the fraudster, and basically, but they were skeptical. They asked questions, and sometimes they actually just berated him. But But he was good. He was a good sport about it. And then there's the full engagement group. This is the group that engaged without skepticism and provided information. And what we were really seeking was the last 4 digits of the Social Security number. We didn't get that a lot, but we got other information out of them. None of it was recorded, by the way. So essentially, the key takeaway here is that 16% number we thought was pretty high, right? We weren't expecting to get that. Remember, our fraudster did not use high-pressure tactics like true fraudsters. So this is probably a floor, right? Here it is 16%. And then finally we looked at some correlates. In terms of cognition, the skeptical engagement group had the highest cognition. This surprised us. We thought the highest cognition was going to be in a no engagement group because the best way to deal with fraud is not to engage. But we found it in the skeptical engagement group, and also we found the lowest levels of financial literacy in the full engagement group and lowest levels of scam awareness in the full engagement group. So I am going to, I'm pretty sure my time's up, right? So anyway, just like almost every other presenter today, yeah, there's some takeaways. They're on this slide. The only one I'll point out is that we do think there's some educational opportunities for protecting older adults from financial fraud, which is a pretty big problem in this country right now. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today.